Welcome to the Compass series of conversations with leaders charting the course in impact investing, and thank you for joining us. I'm Ben Thornley, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by a co-host for our Compass series, my Tideline colleague, Jade Huynh. Because the topic of today's Compass series is navigating impact lenses, it's important that we begin by level setting on a definition of what we mean by impact lenses. Jade, turning it to you.
Ben, and thank you to everyone in the audience for participating in this exciting conversation that we're grateful to be having today. So, to kick off the discussion and to weave a common thread across the diverse approaches that we'll be exploring today, we thought it might be helpful to put forth a working definition of what an impact lens is. To this end, the concept of a lens itself is not specific to impact investing per se, but draws from a long academic and social justice lineage. In general, lenses are analytical devices that are rooted in distinct perspectives to facilitate deeper, more critical, and structured thinking that otherwise would likely not have occurred. As it pertains to impact investing, the definition of an impact lens doesn't fall too far from this original concept. An impact lens entails the integration of social analysis into investment strategy setting, analysis, and decision making. The premise behind many impact lenses is that if the subjects of these lenses, who are largely historically marginalized and or deeply underserved groups, are not intentionally centered, then they will likely go overlooked. Thus, the objective of impact lenses is the achievement of systemic social equity outcomes by centering those most prone to being pushed to the margins and by surfacing harms and structural injustices likely to be normalized as business as usual. In practice, lenses can be applied across multiple themes and can also be applied and combined with one another to facilitate intersectional and therefore assumptively more intentional impact. We hope this definition is clarifying, and we invite you, the audience, to continue to reflect on it as we move forward with introducing each of the panelists and their respective lenses. Back to you, Ben.
Right. Thank you, Jade. We'll reserve time for viewer questions toward the end of our panel, so please do use the Q&A function in Zoom to quiz our guests, who it's now my great pleasure to introduce. Joy Anderson is the president and founder of Criterion Institute and has been shaping social capital markets in that role for over 2 decades, including gender lens investing. She was a founder of Good Capital, chaired the board of Village Capital, and started her career as a high school teacher, which in my books is the most noble profession. Welcome, Joy. Tim Docking is the CEO of Refugee Investment Network, a blended finance collaborative dedicated to creating long-term solutions to global forced migration. He's worked at IBM, the US government's Millennium Challenge Corporation, and has taught and directed Africa research at a DC think tank. Welcome, Tim. Caitlin Rosser is Director of Impact Management at Calvert Impact, where she leads Calvert's work to measure and report on impact and partner with industry initiatives, including IRIS, the Operating Principles for Impact Management, and Impact Frontiers Collaborative. Caitlin worked at the US Department of Justice and understands well the importance of linking outcomes to programmatic activities and communicating results. Erica Seth Davies is the CEO of RIA Ventures, which focuses on transforming the US market for sexual, reproductive, and maternal health through investment, ecosystem building, corporate engagement, and narrative change. She's also the founder of the Racial Equity Asset Lab, which centers racial equity in impact investing and works to shift capital to address the persistent racial wealth gap. Welcome, Erica. And finally, Christina Shapiro is president of the Impact Fund for Children, the Bridge Fund at UNICEF USA. She joined UNICEF USA from Goldman Sachs and was an assistant commissioner at the New York City Department of Small Business Services. She's been leading UNICEF USA's development and launch of the Child Lens investment framework. Thank you all again for joining us. Joy, let's start with you. You've been at the center of the emergence of impactful forms of investment and entrepreneurship for a long time now, including the gender lens. Can you please tell us briefly about the gender lens and also the evolving ways in which investors have used the gender lens and the impact that that's had in the real world?
Yes, happy to. And thank you so much for hosting this. I think the early days in impact investing, I remember the sort of times as SOCAP was forming and people were sorting out how they were going to do this impact thing with more intention. But what was missing from those early conversations were different lenses on power. The ability to see, what does this experience of innovation around poverty look like from the perspective of somebody in sub-Saharan Africa? What does it look like from the perspective of a Black woman living in Detroit? How do we understand the very particular experiences? And those are what form these lenses. I think what's really important in the role of lenses in impact investing is that they provide reframes. They allow us to see through a lens, got glasses, they can see through the lenses in your frames, right? All of these metaphors hold up, but they literally allow you to see more clearly. And that can be about seeing impact, right? That can be about ensuring that there isn't unintended consequences from how we make our investments, or seeing possibilities for impact that you might not have seen before in a housing project or whatever. They also, though, make us just on their own terms, fundamentally smarter investors, right? I do believe that a racial equity lens, a gender lens, not only is important to impact, it is material. And I remember giving a speech at I don't know, there were a lot of men there. That's what I remember. And they were not spring chickens. And as these men looked at me and said, but Joy, all those people in Wall Street, if all this gender stuff was so important, they would have figured it out by now. And I thought, no, they wouldn't have, because they don't have the right lenses. They don't have the right data. They don't have the ability to see clearly. And what we want to do as investors is see clearly, right, Ben?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Joy, and we'll come back to the gender lens specifically, but really appreciate that introduction, which I think sets the stage nicely. Tim, turning to you, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees estimates that the total number of people displaced by persecution, conflict, violence, and other social challenges was almost 110 million by the end of 2022. As a population largely framed in the media as recipients of aid, rather than economic agents in their own right, I assume that making the investment case for centering refugees has been more difficult. In introducing the lens, we'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the motivations behind and challenges of constructing the case for the refugee investment lens.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Happy to do that. Our motivations when we started up the Refugee Investment Network, which is a social enterprise, not-for-profit. We did this about 5 years ago, and what was really driving us were three key motivations. As you referenced, there's an unprecedented number of refugees and forcibly displaced people at that time. That number, when we started, has really grown almost exponentially. It's doubled over the last 10 years. Moreover, a phenomenon that we see today is that people who have been displaced are not returning to where they've come from. They're staying long periods of time. Secondly, the humanitarian system is really faced with this overwhelming challenge of dealing with these emergencies that just seem to be coming again and again, as we read in the news almost weekly, it seems, in an environment of declining resources. So while they're doing very important, often life-saving work, it's not finely tuned to current realities on the one hand, and on the other hand, some of their approaches foster dependency when we know that refugees are really looking for self-reliance when we talk to them and meet with them. They're looking for agency, and often they're being put in positions of being dependent. And then thirdly, I said, what really motivated us and drove us from the outset is that we saw that refugees are really exceptionally entrepreneurial. They're often very gritty. They're loyal, often hardworking employees, and therefore we really saw an investment alpha there that we wanted to highlight. But it's taken us some time to get to where we are now, and we faced a number of challenges, which you looked at, and as many of the people tuned in today would probably are saying to themselves, you're putting refugees and investment in the same sentence. Isn't that a bit of a paradox or an oxymoron? So we face that, that narrative, that often negative narrative that surrounds that community as being perhaps a burden when we present them and promote them and want to show the data that show that they really should be seen as an opportunity. Another challenge we really had to face is that there was no asset class. There was no toolbox for interested capital partners to really to use. I mean, when we talked to interested capital investors, they said that, okay, we get the why, but how do you do it? How do you source these investments? How do you measure the impact of our investments, et cetera? And then finally, thirdly, I would just say that, there was really a lack of precedent to mobilize capital. And so we set out to, real quickly, our theory of change is building the field, mobilizing capital, changing that negative narrative, and policy change. Those are the 4 pillars of our work, which I can talk a little bit about later on, Ben, but that's really what sort of animated all of the work that we've been doing to really do the field building work that's gotten us to this place right now, where we're really beginning to see capital move along these lines. So it's really exciting time for us.
Got it. Well, thanks, Tim. We look forward to talking more about that. And it sounds like those activities are not dissimilar, Erica, to the activities that you're leading at RIA Ventures. Our viewers may know you, Erica, primarily through your work at the Racial Equity Asset Lab, where you anchored, I think, the emergence of the racial equity lens and created many of the precepts and practices that provide the basis for racial equity investing. But now you find yourself as CEO of an organization focused on women's reproductive, sexual, and maternal health, which seems to constitute a convergence of the gender, the racial equity, and I'm sure many other lenses related to systemic inequity. Can you share with us more about the various lenses at play for RIA, and then how you translate the use of those lenses into a cohesive investment strategy?
Sure. That's a lot, but we are committed to reproductive and maternal health equity, which of course requires a lens. And so, I think, and it's been stated several times that those things a lens is necessary because of what we've normalized and legitimized with respect to inequity. And so bringing a lens means sort of, one, broadening the aperture so that you're actually seeing who else has been left out, who's been pushed to the margins. But that also means understanding that there are intersections of identity that also drive even deeper inequity. And so when we're talking about reproductive and maternal health equity at RIA, we want to see to it that every person has the opportunity to attain their full reproductive and maternal health potential, and no one is disadvantaged from achieving that potential because of social position or other socially determined circumstances. And so we're talking about race and ethnicity, we're talking about gender identity, sexual orientation, we're talking about income, education, immigrant status, geography in some cases. So really it's asking the questions when we're, kind of looking at particular issue or innovation or problem that an innovation seeks to solve. And including in that an understanding of where are the outcomes most challenged with respect to this, and how do we bring that into the center of problem solving? So in conversations, whether it's just presenting information to the field or in conversations with companies, that's what we're actually trying to get an understanding of as well. So it's innovation and equity; those things don't have to operate at cross purposes. And quite frankly, when you're intentional about it, I think we do get better outcomes. We do solve more problems for more people, and end up with more innovation and a healthier community and an ecosystem. So that's how we think about it. Like, it's a multitude of factors that are part of that lens with respect to health equity.
Got it. And I know there's an excellent framework online at RIA, and we'll make sure we link folks to that, Erica, so they see what it means to take that framework and turn it into a process, like an investment strategy and process for RIA. Yeah. Excellent. Then, Christina, turning to you, Tideline's had the privilege of supporting UNICEF USA in developing the child lens. Can you share more about the child lens, which will be new to many viewers, as well as why a discrete child lens is needed? And what are the ways by which the child lens builds on and extends some of the investment practices we've already been discussing that have emerged out of the gender, the refugee, the racial equity lens, and others?
Thank you, Ben, of course. And I'm really glad to come after Tim and Joy and Erica, because I think what I'll say will make more sense. But we're facing, and we're going to face a lot of the same challenges and opportunities that they have. And for us, childhood is a unique window of opportunity that we know can serve as a powerful engine of equity, prosperity, and possibility. And we also know that investments in children are investments in our future workforce, our consumers, our business owners, our citizens, and our leaders. And because children are so central to our successful future, that is why UNICEF collaborated with Tideline to develop a lens for children that incorporates children as a key stakeholder. And in short, it is an approach to sustainable investing where investors are asked to intentionally consider child-related factors that both advance child outcomes while also minimizing harm. And the lens is grounded in a framework, as are the others. And that framework, because we wanted to ensure a principled approach, it lays out a set of key principles, such as do no harm, not only to children, but do no harm to other impact objectives in pursuit of incorporating children, and encourages investors to consider the whole child. And this is particularly important because we know that children are not economic agents. They exist within their families, within their communities, within their societies, and are deeply impacted by the systems around them that influence their well-being. And it allows for investors to find many ways to be able to impact children. The framework also outlines some key elements, again, part of that principled approach, encouraging strategies to lay out an impact or ESG strategy. So yes, we're aiming for this lens to be both relevant in the ESG and in the impact investing space. It also asks investors to incorporate children into their process or their investment cycles, and to recognize that they have a contribution in how they allocate their capital or their active engagement with companies. And lastly, in creating this framework, we wanted to be intentionally broad or expansive and allow for a wide tent, again, learning from what we've heard from many others who already spoke. And so the framework recognizes that there are many approaches for child lens investing, and they're all relevant. So from a child screening strategy where investors can either positively screen in or actively engage to ensure better business practices that consider children's well-being, which is likely going to be more applicable for investment strategies in the listed or public equity space, to child inclusive strategies, which we think is probably the broadest category, where investors can assess how children are impacted as indirect beneficiaries, which again will apply to a lot of us on the call and many other managers. But also in inclusive could incorporate strategies where child outcomes are one of several discrete impact objectives within a broader portfolio. And lastly, child-centered, where children are the North Star of the fund. And that may be fewer today, but maybe more will come over time. But to answer your second question, why did we think this was necessary, given the other lenses that exist? And Joy, as you said, it's a lens is allowing you to put on your glasses and look out. And for us, we need to look out through the eyes of a child. That is not a lens that's included today. We know that investor actions, for the first reason, is investor actions impact children's well-being, whether it's intentional or unintentional, whether it's direct or indirect. Without the framework, these impacts are simply going to go unrecognized, and they are going unrecognized today. The second thing is that as UNICEF, we know that what a child needs to survive and thrive is not always obvious. And because children are not economic agents, they sit outside the stakeholder framework around which our industry is organized. They simply don't have a seat at the table. And without this framework, a child's voices and needs will go unheard. The third is that because and given children's broad needs, They're multifaceted identities. There are diverse contexts in which they exist. They're uniquely positioned to feel the effects of the work done by all of you that are implementing other lenses or other areas of thematic focus. And in our view, children and a focus on children can be a golden thread, if you will, that can string these different frameworks and allow investors to achieve a view of holistic impact. And the fourth reason, but I think we need to do more case making and elevate more success stories here, is that early research is showing that what is good for children is also good for business. And so in overlooking children, we're simply overlooking what we believe is an investment opportunity. And very quickly, I will say again, we did ask you all for advice. I know Tideline did, and we did as well as we launched this. And our goal in launching this lens is for it to be inclusive, to not compete with other channels or lenses. As we said, it's a broad tent. So we want to see investors and their strategies to be able to recognize themselves. We heard time and time again, don't recreate the wheel. So it is very much aligned with existing market infrastructure and impact standards. And it is meant to be actionable and pragmatic. And so in addition to the framework, the final version will be posted hopefully by end of this week, beginning of next week, but we're going to share a one-pager later on the webinar. And the paper is accompanied by a toolkit for the private markets created by Tideline and a toolkit created by KPMG for listed equities, because we want to make sure, Joy, how you said that it's not just a concept, but we're allowing investors to understand how they can bring it to action. I'll leave it there.
Great. Well, thanks, Christina. And turning now to Caitlin, and at Calvert, I'm sure you often feel like the guinea pig here, because everyone's asking Calvert to go off and implement these lenses, and there are a lot of them. And so I'm just wondering, from your perspective, investors, I imagine, can often feel overwhelmed by this type of conversation, where to start and how to prioritize among the different lenses we've been discussing, or unify them. So as an investor looking to implement several of the lenses, what does it look like for Calvert? How have you managed to, in inverted commas, navigate impact lenses, literally?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, thank you to the Tideline team and everyone here for having me. It is very overwhelming, but it's important to be a guinea pig. It's important to test these concepts, as Erica mentioned in her remarks. Innovation and equity really do go hand in hand, and it's really important to kind of push the envelope and understand not only how to use maybe one of these lenses, but how, as Ben, you mentioned, how these lenses are connected, and kind of centering those who have not been centered in the past. So before I kind of get into some of our journey and a little bit of what hopefully other investors can take away from this, I want to just do a brief intro of Calvert Impact and really kind of center the conversation in our strategy, at least in my remarks. We are a nonprofit impact investing firm that invests through funds and intermediaries across 9 different sectors in over 100 countries. So key takeaways here: we are an indirect investor. We're not investing directly in operating companies. We are investing indirectly through funds and intermediaries. We call those our portfolio partners, and we are very sector diversified. And so it makes impact measurement really interesting and challenging, but it also, I think, explains why lenses are so critical, because it's one of the things that really unites our mission and really unites our strategy. Addressing kind of structural inequities and centering those who the financial system has not centered, in the past. And so lenses, I think, one framing. Joy, I loved your framing concept, and also noticed that everyone except for Jade is wearing glasses. So I thought that was just really, really interesting. And one framing I'm going to use, to borrow Joy's phrasing, is thinking of lenses as both a lens and a lever. And I think that this, what we've been talking about, lenses and levers in concepts, as well as intentionality, contribution, and measurement. And I think of lenses as the kind of intention setting whereas levers are really, what can you pull for greater impact? What's your contribution? How are you measuring it? And so for us, gender equity, racial equity, impact on refugees, impact on children, these are all of the lenses that we're using. So, the lens through which we are centering those who have not been centered in the past. But really, what I want to emphasize is that our journey has been this implementation piece, this testing and implementation. It's been to more intentionally integrate these lenses into our diligence process and our measurement and management process. So how can we, and I think, we'll talk a little bit later about kind of moving beyond intention. And that's the journey that we've been on. And I do want to kind of paint that picture a little bit. Our journey has been, even though, addressing structural inequities has been a core part of our mission since we were founded in '95, our journey from intention to contribution and measurement has been long. Investors do not have to do all of these things immediately. Our journey, our kind of modern journey, began in around 2011 when we were really starting with gender equity. So we saw in our renewable energy portfolio, for example, that we had a lot of portfolio partners funds in our portfolio that were centering women in a space that had not traditionally been centered. Energy access in sub-Saharan Africa with solar home systems, heat cook stoves. And so we said to ourselves, there's an area in our portfolio where our portfolio partners are being more intentional, and we can be more intentional both around intention in investment and measurement on the impact on women. So investors can start with a subset of their portfolio, like we did with gender equity. Don't feel like you've got to wrap your hands around everything, every lens throughout your entire portfolio. You can pick one area where either the lens is the most relevant or you have the most interest from your portfolio companies, your portfolio partners, and then kind of move on from there. And the journey that the journey we continued on is maybe in the mid 2010s rather. We started to realize, okay, well, we've been assessing gender equity in the renewable energy sector much more intentionally. Can we expand that to the rest of our portfolio? And if so, how might we? And how might we engage our portfolio partners on this journey as well? And that's, our portfolio partners, they're lending to the operating companies on the ground. They are the ones, actually doing the work on the ground. You have to be really mindful of the additional burden, as much as there is, the impact rationale, the business case that you can make, the business performance rationale. You do have to be mindful that these exercises do add additional burden to the actual companies operating on the ground. So starting where there's the most relevance for them, where's the most interest, we started to see this was actually working in one part. Let's expand it to the rest of the portfolio. And then in the mid 2010s, we also started to see, what we can be more intentional around racial equity, particularly with entrepreneurs of color that, are being financed by our portfolio partners in the U.S. small business space. So, I kind of paint this picture, kind of walk you along this journey just to show that for us, intersectionality is not where we started. We started with one lens and we started to see, it's actually helping us develop intentionality around another lens. And then we're actually starting to see those lenses converge. In 2019, again, for another example, we worked with the Refugee Investing Network to pilot a refugee investing lens with our portfolio partners. And just this summer, we worked with UNICEF and as part of a cohort that Tideline and UNICEF led to pilot a child lens investing lens, or a child impacted investing lens. And I think we're still working with our portfolio partners to figure out how relevant these are to them, and not necessarily how relevant even, but how feasible are implementing these tools, right now, and how can we support them along this journey. And so, all's to say, we have not yet reached anywhere near the end of our journey. We're still learning, we're still testing and kind of iterating alongside our portfolio partners. I think the key takeaway that I kind of note for everyone is just to get started asking questions. where might some of these be relevant in your portfolio, and where might you find kind of willing partners along the way?
Right. Thanks, Caitlin. And please do keep the questions coming through the Q&A function, and we'll be turning to those shortly, but I'll turn it over to Jade, and we'll have some more questions before we turn to our audience questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks to all of the panelists for the excellent discussion so far. And I'm hearing so many key sound bites here that lenses aren't niche, they widen the aperture, that they deepen investor intentionality, and even allow us to move beyond intention. They help to reframe prevailing narratives and harm that is normalized. They let us see more clearly and allow investors to achieve more holistic impact. And they even let investors seize opportunities that are great, but not necessarily the most obvious. And Caitlin, I love the framing of lenses as both lenses and levers. But as we move into the second half of the discussion, we'll be digging deeper into the importance, the case, and the value of these impact lenses for investors. And we'll also dig into what it means to build a field and a movement behind these lenses and future directions. So my first question goes to Erica. So Erica, from the first half of the discussion, we know that a lot of effort's needed by investors to understand impact lenses and to practically navigate them. But we haven't really delved too directly into the case for making the effort to begin with. So building on what you shared earlier, that lenses can result in more innovation, better outcomes. In your view, what's the overarching rationale for adopting a lens or to widen the aperture? And to nuance the question further, what's the case for individual organizations to adopt them as well as the field writ large?
Sure. So I think one of the things that we don't investigate often enough, but there has been research on this, that inequity cost, right? Like there's actually a dollar cost to it. So when you don't have full participation in society, in the workforce, in the economy, like that's actually costing you growth. And so by not bringing these more intentional lenses to across the spectrum of approaches, that we are not realizing full growth potential in society, in our economy, with respect to health, in the workforce, like it can go on and on. And so this isn't a zero-sum game, right? Like there are things to be gained from this when we're much more intentional about applying a lens. Also, I would just suggest that, we are facing some pretty big challenges, right? Globally and locally and nationally, right? So to be able to tackle the level of challenge, one, it's not going to be the same ideas and the same thinking and the same approaches that got us there in the first place that are going to be the ones that solve it. So these adaptive challenges need new players, need new voices, need the experience and the perspective of folks who've been closest to the problems to develop the solutions. And I would say, like, in this process, three things are going to start to unfold or be understood consistently. One, it's an interrogation of power. I think, Joy mentioned that at the top of the conversation. Two, we're going to be looking at systems change, right? Like there's no way to do this deeply without having some pretty significant understanding of other levers that are driving outcomes. And three, there's going to be a root cause analysis, because we have to understand how we got here in the first place. So just sort of having that historic perspective, and that gives context, right? Like what's shaping the contours of what we're doing right now. And I think when we kind of go through and understand those elements of bringing a particular lens to the work, we'll realize, like, actually this is something that we can resolve, right? Like we can make progress in these different areas and through these lenses, because it just simply does require a different point of view, and it helps us from recreating harm. And so one of the things that I, tell just an example over and over again, of racial equity investing, is that what we don't want to do is what's called a predatory inclusion, right? And so when we look at simply including Black people and Black communities in, sort of your chain of capital in a particular way, that can lead to harm, right? Like that can reproduce the harms that emerge from redlining, for example, and we've seen it actually happen. And so the lens because of the perspective that is embedded in that, because of that understanding of root cause, gives you the opportunity to generate really productive alternatives and solutions from which everyone can actually benefit. So that would be my big takeaway, my big recommendation on the why.
I love the concept of adopting an impact lens as a means to fuel imagination, to dream of better ways of addressing harm, and also as insurance against mitigating harm. And so we'll turn over to our next panelist, Christina. So for here, we're going to double click further on child lens investing. So understanding that the child lens is soon to officially debut in the market, which we're so excited about. Where does UNICEF USA go from here? How are you intending to socialize the child lens in the market over the coming years? And while we're at it, what does success look like to you in the context of child lens investing?
Thank you, Jade. Also really excited, but also Erica, thank you for teaching me a new term that I didn't know, and around predatory inclusion, really helpful to learn that from you. So the first thing I'll say is we have already been busy gathering feedback, and we're going to continue to do it. I think Caitlin alluded to the fact, so thank you for mentioning that, Caitlin, that we did launch a cohort this about 4 or 5 months ago that Tideline led to get feedback, real-time feedback from 6 different fund managers. And it included a walkthrough through the child lens investing curriculum. And it was really integral to test the feasibility of the framework and the toolkit. It was focused more on private markets in this case. And it helped us identify blind spots. How we define the classification of investor strategies has really evolved based on the feedback that we received from participants in that group. It also reinforced strengths, and we've already seen some initial efforts for improvements. And again, really pleased to see an entity like Calvert, who went out and asked some of its managers if they were able to start to report on some child-specific metrics. And that's already a really significant start. And we're going to continue to do more of that. I know in partnership with our UNICEF colleagues at the Office of Innovation, we've held roundtables and information sessions, and our team here in the US have started to speak to foundations and investment advisors to continue to build our knowledge base. So absolutely more socialization. And in fact, when the paper is published, what you'll see is that we're inviting people to help co-create and further develop this framework with us. You asked about the vision and next steps, but to tell you about a vision, I want to paint the vision and also a practical pathway. So the vision, of course, in our view, is that it's a world where children are accounted for in investment decisions with intentionality, and where more capital flows to companies that have business practices that consider children's well-being, and more capital flows to investments and solutions for children, including the most vulnerable. And when we uplift children, we uplift everyone. So that is a mantra that we are going to continue to repeat and hold up. Practically speaking, and I think Caitlin said it really well, we know it's going to take time. We do envision a world where there's widespread adoption of the child lens. And again, that is going to mean different things to different investment strategies, either in the public or private capital space. And that is okay. But we want to see more investors see themselves reflected in this framework. And that could look like more investors adopting the child risk questionnaires, which is one of the tools that are part of the toolkit that Tideline helped to develop. And certainly that will help avoid harm, which is a minimum, but here the expectation is that benefits will be maximized. We also expect more tracking of outcomes and standardization of metrics to track and elevate those outcomes. So I think that is something, and again, I think we will, there's more work that we need to do to elevate success stories through case making, to continue to convene stakeholders, to have these conversations, to ensure that we're converging what child lens investing is with other accepted standards and or lenses, and hopefully over time, really start to crowd in more capital to focus on the things that are near and dear to our hearts. And we are committed to doing that work, to building out different thematic guides that allow us to bring the child lens to life across different areas of thematic investing, which is something that we've already heard could be really helpful as we started conversations, for examples, with some affordable housing investors who really love the idea, but want a little bit more depth that is applied to their area of focus. So really excited to be on this journey, and will benefit from the feedback of all of those who both have the capital and allocate the capital.
Thanks, Christina. And what I love of your answer is this combination of big picture imaginative thinking and sort of the practicalities of what it means to implement the child lens. It's wonderful to hear. We're going to zoom out a bit, widen the aperture, so to speak, and discuss the use of lenses in general by turning to Joy. So Joy, just taking off your gender lens hat for a bit for this half of the discussion, Criterion has been engaged in really cross-cutting efforts over the years. You've been laying the conceptual and the tactical groundwork for various lens movements. For example, you've most even recently been part of the broader market effort to lay the groundwork for child lens investing. You've previously done work on the LGBTQI lens. So from your vantage point, different lenses serve different purposes, or as we heard from Caitlin and Christina, potentially converge. And how should investors approach the introduction of new impact lenses like the child lens?
Great question. And maybe building a little bit on Caitlin's point about what's overwhelming about this, right? It's sort of the, gosh, you want me to think about more than one thing at the same time, right? And it's hard, right? Like, the number of people who have said to me, well, I've just got gender and now you want me to think about race. I was like, well, actually, I wanted you to be thinking about race and gender and children the whole time. I wanted you to holistically look at the world and have a broader lens. And so I think one of the pieces is, I think this really starts not with, this starts with the systemic exclusion of a broad set of perspectives from finance. We're not starting with everybody having a clear picture and a full understanding of the human experience. We're starting with a fundamental problem in finance where the folks who have been making decisions in finance do not necessarily incorporate a broad enough set of perspectives into that decision making. And so we've ended up with patterns where, just as we look at analyzing the recovery, the basic reality is the experience of Black women in the United States drives the recovery. Those are sort of data points that we know, but they're not valued within systems finance as relevant, right? We know that gender-based violence is a systemic risk in the world, right? The number of people who experience gender-based violence cannot be irrelevant. We discovered that climate is, we've all sort of come to a point where we understand that you can't completely ignore climate, but that's the same thing with all the rest of these things. And so here's a way to think about this. One is, it's what complexity we tolerate. Right? At some point, you choose, right? There's a lot of complexity in investing. I'm sitting in the middle of investment decisions and there's lots of complexity. What complexity is tolerated? Ooh, don't ask me to think about both gender, race, and children, and refugees, and geographic experiences. That's too much. Well, why is that too much? Right? So just questioning what complexity is tolerated and why do we draw a line here to say, I can't have an intersectional lens? Because the reality is these lenses have to be intersectional. You can't look at children without also looking at gender. You can't look at refugees without also looking at colonial patterns of geography. So there isn't actually a way to separate all of these, and oversimplifying leads you to things that are wrong. You make wrong decisions if you oversimplify a lens. And I know people want simplicity, and I know at some point we have to come up with simple frameworks that people can use. But we do that to our peril. And so the piece I really want to say, though, is what is common. And this is where I think Tideline just teed up this webinar so elegantly. Because what's common to all of these lenses is power. As Erica said, this is about power. This is about whose data matters. This is about whose voice matters. This is about whose experience matters. Gender, right? Gender lens investing is not just about women. Gender is about the power dynamics between the genders. It's not just the identity of being a woman. It's the power dynamics in how we construct gendered experiences in the world, and how does that play out? So at the core of this is power. So part of what I think we need to be moving towards is, and criteria, this is a core of what Criterion's work is right now, with the support of actually UNICEF and the Canadian government and many philanthropists, Ford Foundation, and others. We've been working on a set of standards of practice within, we're starting with gender lens investing, but honestly, they're relevant to, they're relevant far beyond that, because the question they ask is, what are the power dynamics in how investors analyze data and make decisions? What data is included? What data is missing? Second, how do we look at the structures we use in finance? How do we look at how structures inform power dynamics in relationships? So how we make an investment, what terms we use, what vehicles we use, how we structure an investment shapes power dynamics, right? We can, I'm currently, making this call from Kenya and sitting in room after room with entrepreneurs who say how the capital was designed doesn't work for me, right? Back to Erica's point about like, not all capital is good capital. Some capital is actually harmful if the structures don't address the power dynamics. And then the third thing is really looking at our processes and whose expertise matters. Because this is the core of diversity and inclusion. It's not just about, I fully believe that it's important to do representation and have women at tables and make sure that we have diverse representation in all kinds of ways, but inclusion is about whose expertise matters. And are we listening to people who have the ability to analyze in context? Are we valuing that knowledge? Are we including it in our processes? And I believe almost everything we're talking about is cost neutral over time. The two things you pay for to make all these changes, right? Because we're like, oh my gosh, all of this is so expensive. It is cost neutral over time. One, you have to find the right data and do the right analysis. And then once you've got it, you don't have to do it every minute, right? Once you figure out how your investment thesis relates to different experiences, you can go on. So the first thing is you have to do the upfront work. The second is you have to be willing to confront biases. I think one of the core challenges that in all of these lenses is to say, let's not keep paying for bias. I can't incorporate those things. It's too hard. That's beyond my reach. Okay, well, it's not actually, it's all available. The question is, are you willing to take it on? And so how do we really call the question on that? Because in the end, all of these lenses come back to power.
Such a great response, Joy, and honestly meriting of its own panel discussion, all on the topic of power itself. But in the interest of time, I might turn to our next two panelists, and hopefully we can touch on this discussion within the remaining 10 minutes. But let's turn to Tim. Let's dig into the toolbox and the pillars that you alluded to earlier. What has been your experience from the Refugee Investment Network of building momentum for refugee lens investing? And who have been its primary adopters, and what has been your experience to date in encouraging more mainstream use of the refugee lens?
Thanks, Jade. You know, it's been a lot of hard work, which I think many of my fellow panelists can probably relate to when you create a new asset class or something that wasn't there before. But we're seeing a lot of really promising developments and evidence of usage of this idea of a refugee lens and refugee lens investing generally. I think broadly, the primary early adopters that we've seen come through are development finance partners, DFIs, sort of in the development lingo, organizations like multilateral development banks, like the Inter-American Development Bank, or the IFC is catching on to this, the International Financial Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank, and others. Bilateral development agencies like the Swiss have supported our work, the Japanese have supported our work. And you know, what's the interest there? We believe that you know, there's a growing appreciation for sort of the horizontal nature of the refugee issue and the forced displaced issue, which we were talking about earlier, which I mentioned earlier. That is, it cuts across the sustainable development goals. If folks are familiar with those, while it isn't called out, it touches, we think, 13 of those 17 SDGs. And I think there's a growing appreciation for that. Another reason behind that, I think, is that the humanitarian partners that we work with are sort of at their wits' end. They're very much overwhelmed by this surge that I referred to earlier, and the accelerating nature of it, the hardship that millions of people around the world are facing, and the related instability that it's causing in hosting countries, political instability, et cetera. So they're looking for new solutions. And I think we've been really working hard to build this field that they can then turn to. That taxonomy, that lens that hopefully folks get a chance to look at on our website, we've tried to design to be pretty straightforward. Folks familiar with the gender lens will see something that looks familiar to them. We worked a lot with the gender lens folks at the outset, and they helped us to avoid and swerve around some of the early errors they might have made, or some of the pitfalls they've suffered. We've kept our lens quite broad and the aperture wide, and so people feel like it's they're able to apply it in various ways. So the research we've done, the market assessments, the pipeline, the literal pipeline that were created so we can help folks source investments. The technical assistance models were developed, have really been helpful as well. So that field building work is being used, and that's awesome to see. Non-governmental organizations, I think, are being early adopters. They like the sustainability of the model. In other words, the revenues generated, the surplus generated from some of the work, that can be connected with this, can help them continue to cover costs, again, in an environment of constrained resources. So there's reasons for that as well. They also like, the increased agency, which refugee lens investing brings as well. Decreased dependency, increased impact they're seeing too with it. There's a cultural element. Jade, you mentioned, future sessions. We should maybe do a session on, the culture of investment in the likes of some of the DFIs and NGOs in particular, which is something that is a challenge that we have to work with. Business, finance, investment are often foreign concepts in these areas that we try to cater to and try to work with folks in. We sort of do a lot of literal, figurative interpreting between the sides. And just quickly, I'll mention that impact investors, we're seeing growing usage of the lens, of the RLI, refugee lens investing concept there. We're tracking about 10 funds that are already making investments or taking shape right now. That's really exciting. As we do deep dives into areas that employ a lot of forcibly displaced people, like agriculture, or affect a lot of forcibly displaced people, like affordable housing. These, asset-backed sorts of investments that investors might be more familiar with and comfortable with. We see a lot of pickup on that work that we do. And then finally, I'll just mention companies that unwittingly maybe have a lot of people who have been forcibly displaced in their workforce are interested in beginning to count and be more intentional about their engagement and outreach to these communities, of the products and services they design, and aim towards those communities as well. So we really feel like this is demand driven. We're trying to respond to that demand. And now we're seeing a bit of commoditization to the work we're doing. When we bid on a contract, there's a lot of other bidders, which is awesome. That allows us to move more into this advisory work that we're turning to now to help get from field building to the mobilization of capital. And that's where we're going forward, hopefully in these next years, and we're already seeing some work there. So mobilizing capital at scale to create jobs, to provide things like affordable housing for forcibly displaced people, and to get those entrepreneurs access to capital, which is really, when you speak with displaced people, that's what they're often really looking for. So I hope that addresses the question, Jade.
It absolutely did, Tim. Thank you so much. And it's been really inspiring to see the RIN's growth. And last but certainly not least, Caitlin. So from your seasoned practitioner's perspective, what would it mean for Calvert to deepen its practice in the use of lenses? And what would you hope we would be discussing about impact lenses in 5 years' time? And just to add in one more question, because I can't help myself, to what extent are the benefits of using various impact lenses clear to Calvert as a practitioner?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think to tackle your last question, quite easily, the benefits are quite clear. And I think one way to put it, and particularly given the time, just to try to wrap up a little bit in a summary. We've been talking so much about the why and the how a little bit. The kind of last half of the conversation was a little bit about the how. Obviously, checking out all of the toolkits that have been posted in the chat really helped to Joy's point. Maybe not simplify, but make sense of the complex information that we're getting. All of the complex contextualized information that hopefully we are actually getting and assessing. And what I hope is that we can move in the next few years. We've moved well beyond the why. The why, the case has been made and continues to be made. And certainly I hope that in 5 years it will have been made and we will move beyond that conversation. We will be moving beyond the how conversation. We have these tools. Investors just need to start using them, start understanding them, start understanding how they can be helpful in kind of providing insight into those power dynamics that exist in their specific contexts, and then move really into the what. Okay, so we've moved beyond the why, we've got the how down. Let's actually start focusing on the impact and measuring the impact and really understanding, are we impacting these stakeholders that we say that we want to center because they haven't been centered before? Are we actually doing that? And in what kind of ways, and in a really contextualized manner. So I'll kind of just leave it there.
Well, thank you, Caitlin. They were nice concluding remarks. Unfortunately, we are going to have to end the discussion, but I think a big takeaway for me is that if we have the right data going into the process, we'll have the right results coming out of the process. This is about doing investment well and doing investment better. And thank you to all of our panelists, Joy, Tim, Caitlin, Erica, Christina. We appreciate the work you do so much. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And thank you to our viewers and to our Tideline crew in the background, Olivia and Yael, for helping organize the webinar. We look forward to seeing you all again for our next Compass Series discussion. And thank you for being with us, and take good care. Thanks, everyone. All right. Bye for now.